In 1841, a British explorer named James Clark Ross sailed farther south than almost anyone thought possible. Then he hit a wall, not a coastline, not a mountain range, a vertical barrier of ice stretching beyond the horizon. Ross estimated parts of it rose more than 150 feet above the sea. It appeared so vast that it looked less like a glacier and more like the edge of another world. For decades, maps would simply call it the Great Ice Barrier. Today, we know it as the Ross Ice Shelf. But here's the question. How did a frozen wall discovered by a 19th century expedition become one of the most strategically important locations in Antarctica? And why did the nations that later shaped Antarctic policy focus so heavily on the region surrounding it? The answer is not the one most conspiracy theories claim, but the real story may be stranger than the myth. If the place's official history keeps at the edge of the map interests you, subscribe to The Forgotten Century. This channel follows the documented record first. The expeditions, the journals, the treaties, and the forgotten details that rarely make it into the mainstream version of history. Because sometimes the real mystery isn't what people claim happened. It's what the historical record quietly reveals when you read it closely. The Ross Ice Shelf is difficult to understand until you grasp its scale. This is not a normal glacier. It is the largest ice shelf in Antarctica, roughly the size of France. A floating platform of ice attached to the Antarctic continent, extending hundreds of miles into the Ross Sea. For generations of explorers, it served two roles at once. It was a barrier, and it was a gateway. When James Clark Ross encountered it in 1841, the feature seemed almost impossible to cross. Ships could not simply sail through it. The wall of ice blocked further movement south. Yet later explorers discovered something unexpected. The shelf also provided one of the most practical routes toward the interior of Antarctica. That made it valuable. Very valuable. Roald Amundsen used the region during his successful race to the South Pole in 1911. Robert Falcon Scott launched his own polar effort from the same general area. Decades later, Richard Byrd established a series of bases called Little America directly on the Ross Ice Shelf. Again and again, major expeditions returned to this one location. That alone is not suspicious. It makes geographic sense. But it raises an important question. Why did so much of Antarctica's exploration history converge on the same frozen region? The mystery deepens when we move beyond exploration and into politics. By the middle of the 20th century, Antarctica was no longer just a destination for adventurers. Nations were beginning to think strategically. Territorial claims appeared on maps. Military resources entered the picture. Large-scale aerial surveys were launched. Then came a treaty unlike almost any other on Earth. A treaty that froze territorial disputes, restricted military activity, and created a unique international system for governing an entire continent. Many people look at those facts and jump straight to a hidden civilization theory. But before we go anywhere near that conclusion, we need to deal with the most popular story circulating online, because after checking the evidence, that story falls apart. And once it does, the real puzzle finally comes into focus. If you've spent any time in the Antarctica rabbit hole, you've probably heard a version of the same story. The claim usually goes like this. Operation Highjump arrived in Antarctica in 1946. The expedition supposedly discovered something extraordinary near the Ross Ice Shelf. Maybe an ancient civilization, maybe advanced technology, maybe the remains of a forgotten world buried beneath the ice. According to the story, governments immediately realized what had been found. Antarctica was then sealed off. The Antarctic Treaty became the mechanism used to keep ordinary people away. And everything that happened afterward was part of a coordinated cover-up. It's a powerful narrative. The problem is that when you start verifying the details, the foundation begins to crack. First, the Ross Ice Shelf was not a secret discovery of Operation Highjump. By 1946, explorers had been operating in the region for more than a century. Ross documented it in 1841. Scott worked there. Amundsen worked there. Byrd built bases there. The idea that Highjump suddenly stumbled upon a previously unknown frozen kingdom near the shelf doesn't fit the historical timeline. The location was already one of the best-known regions in Antarctica. Second, Antarctica was not closed after Highjump. This is easy to check. Research stations continued operating. Scientific expeditions increased. Multiple countries expanded their presence. Eventually, tourism developed as well. If the goal was total secrecy, it was an unusually public way of achieving it. Third, the Antarctic Treaty itself doesn't say what many internet posts claim it says. The treaty prohibited military activity and suspended conflicts over territorial claims. It promoted scientific cooperation. It did not declare Antarctica forbidden to all civilians. It did not state that hidden discoveries must remain secret. It did not contain language about ancient civilizations, lost technology, or buried empires. That doesn't mean every question is answered. It means we should be careful about claiming more than the documents support. And this is where many videos stop. They either repeat the conspiracy as fact, or they dismiss everything as nonsense. Both approaches miss something important, because once the exaggerated version collapses, a more interesting question remains. Why did governments care so much about Antarctica in the first place? Why did multiple nations rush to establish claims before the treaty era? Why did the Ross Sea sector become such a recurring focus of exploration, logistics, mapping, and scientific infrastructure? And why did Antarctica receive a governance system unlike almost anywhere else on Earth? Those questions are real. The documents are real. The expeditions are real. The political competition was real. And when you follow that trail through the historical record, you find something much more compelling than a recycled internet theory. You find a continent that gradually transformed from a geographic curiosity into a place governments considered important enough to regulate, negotiate over, and protect. Not because someone proved a lost civilization existed there. There is no verified evidence for that. But because Antarctica represented something else, something strategic, something scientific, and possibly something we still do not fully understand. To see why, we have to go back to the explorers who turned the Ross ice shelf from a wall at the edge of the world into the front door of Antarctica. When James Clark Ross first encountered the Great Ice Barrier in January of 1841, he wasn't searching for a hidden civilization. He was pursuing a scientific mission. His expedition was investigating Earth's magnetic field and pushing farther south than previous navigators had managed. What he found was astonishing enough on its own, a massive wall of ice extending beyond sight. To Ross it appeared nearly endless. He followed its edge for hundreds of miles. No opening appeared, no passage revealed itself. For the explorers of the 19th century, the barrier seemed less like a landscape feature and more like a natural border. But geography has a way of changing how people think. The more Antarctica was studied, the more explorers realized that this obstacle also created opportunities. By the early 20th century, the Ross Sea region had become one of the most practical entry points into the continent. That fact would shape the entire history of Antarctic exploration. In 1901, Robert Falcon Scott arrived during the Discovery expedition. Scott and his team used the Ross Sea area as a launching point for journeys into the interior. The expedition gathered scientific data, mapped previously unknown territory, and demonstrated that sustained operations in Antarctica were possible. A decade later, another explorer would take advantage of the same geographic reality, Roald Amundsen. When Amundsen mounted his attempt to reach the South Pole, he selected the Bay of Whales on the edge of the Ross ice shelf as his base of operations. This decision proved critical. The route provided relatively efficient access to the polar plateau. In December of 1911, Amundsen became the first person to reach the South Pole. The Ross ice shelf had played a central role in that achievement. Then came Richard Byrd, and this is where the story becomes especially important. Byrd was not simply conducting a single expedition. He was helping transform Antarctica into a place of long-term operations. Beginning in 1929, Byrd established a base called Little America on the Ross ice shelf. The name sounded temporary. The reality was far more significant. Little America became a hub. Aircraft operated from the region. Scientific observations expanded. New mapping efforts accelerated. Subsequent Byrd expeditions returned and built additional versions of Little America nearby. Again and again, the Ross Ice Shelf served as the foundation. That pattern matters, because explorers were not randomly scattered across Antarctica. They repeatedly concentrated resources in the same general sector, not because of hidden ruins, not because of secret technology, because geography kept pulling them back. The Ross Sea region offered access, the shelf offered a platform, and the surrounding area became one of the best understood parts of the continent. Then the technology changed. Aircraft replaced some of the limitations of surface travel. Large-scale aerial reconnaissance became possible, and what had once been an explorer's frontier started attracting the attention of governments operating on an entirely different scale. The transition from exploration to strategy was underway, and the expedition that symbolized that shift more than any other was Operation Highjump. By the time Operation Highjump began in 1946, Antarctica was no longer an unknown continent. Large portions remained unmapped, much was still mysterious, but the age of simply discovering Antarctica was ending. A new phase was beginning. Operation Highjump was the largest Antarctic expedition ever organized up to that point. The numbers alone were extraordinary. Thousands of personnel, dozens of aircraft, multiple ships, extensive photographic surveys. The operation's official objectives included training personnel in polar conditions, testing equipment, expanding American knowledge of Antarctica, and conducting aerial mapping on a scale never attempted before. This is where many conspiracy stories take a sharp turn. The documented record shows a huge mapping effort. The mythology transforms that into the discovery of hidden structures. Those are not the same thing. What Highjump undeniably demonstrated was something else. Antarctica had become strategically important enough to justify massive investment. That fact is documented, and it wasn't only the United States paying attention. Several nations had already made territorial claims across Antarctica. Britain, New Zealand, Australia, France, Norway, Chile, Argentina. Maps began showing sectors and boundaries. Some claims overlapped, some created diplomatic tensions, and one of the most significant claimed regions sat directly beside the Ross Sea. The Ross Dependency, administered by New Zealand but originally linked to British imperial claims. By the 1950s, Antarctica faced a problem, not a hidden city problem, a geopolitical problem. Multiple nations were interested in the continent. Technology was improving. The Cold War was beginning. Competition was increasing. Under normal circumstances, that combination might have produced conflict. Instead, something unusual happened. The International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958 brought scientists from many countries together for cooperative research. Antarctica became a laboratory. Data was shared. Research stations expanded. International collaboration proved possible. That momentum led directly to the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. This is one of the most important documents in Antarctic history, and one of the most misunderstood. The treaty did not divide Antarctica among secret powers. It did not declare the continent permanently closed. What it did was freeze territorial disputes. Countries did not abandon their claims. They agreed not to fight over them. Military activity was heavily restricted. Scientific investigation was encouraged. Inspection mechanisms were introduced. The result was unprecedented. An entire continent governed through international agreement rather than conventional sovereignty. Even today, that arrangement remains unusual. And this is where the word restricted enters the story, not as internet mythology. As documented policy, modern Antarctica contains specially protected areas. Certain regions require permits. Scientific sites can have strict access rules. Environmental protections limit what visitors may do. Some locations are effectively inaccessible without official authorization. Those restrictions are real, but their stated purpose is conservation, research protection, and environmental management. Whether every restriction serves only those purposes is a larger question. The documents tell us why the rules exist. They do not automatically prove every motive behind them. What makes the Ross Ice Shelf important is not that it became forbidden. It is that the region repeatedly sits at the center of Antarctica's story. Exploration, logistics, scientific expansion, territorial interest, international governance. Again and again, the trail leads back to the same frozen frontier. And that raises a question that survives even after the grand conspiracy claims are removed. Why did this particular region become so central to the future of an entire continent? Because once you step back and look at the pattern, the answer may not be as simple as, it's just ice. At this point, it's important to separate what we know from what we think we know. The documented facts are straightforward. James Clark Ross discovered the Great Ice Barrier in 1841. Major explorers repeatedly returned to the Ross Sea sector. Byrd established long-term operational bases there. Operation Highjump dramatically expanded aerial mapping. The Antarctic Treaty created a unique international framework for the continent. Protected zones and regulated access areas exist today. Those points are supported by the historical record. Now comes the harder part. What do those facts mean? This is where interpretations begin to diverge. One interpretation is entirely conventional. The Ross Ice Shelf became important because geography made it useful. Explorers used it because it offered practical access to the interior. Scientists used it because infrastructure already existed there. Governments focused on Antarctica because it held scientific value, strategic significance, and potential future resources. Viewed through that lens, the story is simple. No hidden civilization is required. No secret discovery is necessary. History unfolds exactly as official accounts describe. That explanation deserves to be taken seriously because it fits much of the available evidence. But there is another observation that some researchers and independent historians find difficult to ignore. Throughout history, governments rarely create elaborate international systems around places they consider completely irrelevant. That does not prove a hidden secret. It simply raises a question. Why did Antarctica become the subject of such unusual political attention? Think about the sequence. First came exploration, then mapping, then territorial claims, then large-scale scientific programs, then international treaty unlike almost anything else on Earth, one layer after another, one layer of over-annexation after another. The continent moved steadily from the edge of the known world toward the center of international management. Again, that pattern does not prove a cover-up. But it is a pattern, and patterns deserve examination. Another point often overlooked involves uncertainty itself. Antarctica remains enormous. Despite decades of research, much of the continent remains difficult to access. Conditions are extreme. Field seasons are limited. Ice can conceal landscapes for thousands or even millions of years. Subglacial mountain ranges have been discovered. Hidden lakes have been found beneath the ice. Entire geological systems remained unknown until modern technology revealed them. In other words, Antarctica has repeatedly demonstrated that it still contains surprises. Real surprises. Documented surprises, not internet rumors. That distinction matters, because once people see genuine unknowns, they often rush to fill the gaps with certainty. The problem is that certainty is rarely justified. Could there be archaeological discoveries beneath Antarctic ice? Possibly. Scientists have speculated about what ancient landscapes may exist beneath the ice sheet, but no verified evidence demonstrates a lost advanced civilization beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. Could governments possess information that is not widely discussed by the public? Almost certainly. Governments possess specialized information about countless subjects. That alone proves nothing extraordinary. Could the true historical significance of Antarctica be greater than most people realize? That is a reasonable possibility. The continent influences climate systems, contains immense quantities of fresh water, offers scientific insights into Earth's past, and occupies a strategic position in global affairs. Those realities are substantial enough without adding unsupported claims. This is why restraint matters. The weakest argument says, we don't know everything, therefore the conspiracy must be true. The stronger argument says something else. We don't know everything, so let's look carefully at what the evidence actually shows. And when you do that, an intriguing picture emerges. A remote ice shelf discovered in 1841 gradually became one of the most important locations in Antarctic history. Explorers depended on it, governments studied it, scientists returned to it, international agreements were shaped around a continent in which it played a central role. None of that proves a hidden civilization, but neither does it support the idea that Antarctica is merely an empty, irrelevant wasteland. The historical record points somewhere in between, toward a place that is known and yet still not fully understood. The most interesting mysteries are not always the ones with the most dramatic answers. Sometimes they're the ones that refuse to disappear. The Ross Ice Shelf was first recorded as a seemingly endless wall of ice. More than 180 years later, it remains one of the defining features of Antarctica. Generations of explorers crossed its edge. Nations built policy around the continent beyond it. Scientists continue to study it. And despite everything we've learned, questions remain. Not because the evidence proves a hidden civilization. It doesn't. Not because a secret treaty sealed Antarctica from humanity. It didn't. But because a discovery made in 1841 triggered a chain of events that still shapes the southernmost continent today. So here's the question. If the Ross Ice Shelf was simply a geographic obstacle, why did so much of Antarctica's exploration, logistics, science, and international politics end up revolving around the region surrounding it? And another question. As technology reveals more of what lies beneath Antarctica's ice, what discoveries are still waiting to emerge from a landscape that remains one of the least understood on Earth? Perhaps the biggest mystery isn't what has been hidden. Perhaps it's how much remains undiscovered. If you found this investigation valuable, share it with someone who enjoys following the evidence beyond the official headlines.